She took lashes to protect the poor rancher. The next day, her giant Apache brothers surrounded his farm. Porter Dale watched in horror as the leather cracked against her back for the third time. The woman hadn't even looked at him once during her punishment, yet somehow everyone in town knew she was taking his lashing. He'd never seen her before in his life. She was Apache. He could tell by her dress and the way she held her chin high even as blood seeped through the fabric. But why would a complete stranger step forward when the marshal called his name? Why would she say those 3 words that saved him? "I'll take his." The crowd had gone silent. Even the marshal seemed confused. In 20 years of dispensing justice, he'd never seen someone voluntarily take another's punishment, especially not for a debt they had no part in. Porter tried to step forward, to stop it, but 2 hands grabbed his shoulders. "She chose this," someone whispered behind him. "Don't make it worse." When it was over, she walked past him without a word. No explanation, no eye contact, just the faint scent of sage and the sound of her moccasins on the dusty ground. Porter called out to her, but she disappeared into the crowd like smoke. That night he couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her taking what should have been his pain. But the next morning, when he stepped out to tend his horses, 3 massive Apache warriors stood at the edge of his property. They weren't there for conversation. They weren't there for trade. They were there for answers about their sister. And the way they looked at him suggested they already knew something he didn't. Porter's hands shook as he poured water from the well bucket. Every movement sent fresh waves of guilt through his chest. That woman had bled for his debts, and he didn't even know her name. He'd spent the entire night pacing his small cabin, replaying every second. The marshal had called for Porter Dale to step forward and receive his punishment for the unpaid grain debt. 10 lashes, standard penalty. Porter had walked forward, accepting his fate, when suddenly she appeared. An Apache woman in a simple brown dress, her black hair braided down her back. She'd stepped between him and the whipping post without hesitation. "I'll take his," she had said, her voice steady as stone. The crowd had erupted in whispers. The marshal had scratched his head, clearly bewildered. Porter had tried to protest, but she'd given him one sharp look that silenced him completely. Those dark eyes held something he couldn't understand. Not pity, not kindness, but something deeper. Something that suggested she knew him better than he knew himself. Now, as Porter fed his 3 horses in the small corral behind his cabin, he couldn't shake the memory of her silence. She'd taken every lash without a sound. When it was over, she'd simply walked away, ignoring his calls, his desperate attempts to thank her or understand why. He'd asked everyone in town afterward. Nobody knew her name. Old Henrik at the general store said he'd seen Apache traders come through, but never her specifically. The blacksmith thought he'd glimpsed her near the river once, but wasn't certain. She was a ghost, a mystery wrapped in flesh and blood that had saved him for reasons he couldn't fathom. Porter kicked at the dirt, frustrated with his own helplessness. The debt had been real. $30 he owed for grain seed that had failed to grow properly last season. He'd known the lashing was coming, had prepared himself for it, but this woman had stolen even his chance to face his own consequences. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across his small plot of land. Porter had inherited this struggling farm from his father, along with all its debts and disappointments. Every year was a battle against weather, creditors, and his own limitations. He'd never asked for help before, never wanted it. So why had she given it? As he turned toward his cabin, something caught his eye on the horizon. 3 figures on horseback, moving with the steady purpose of men who'd traveled far. Even from a distance he could see they were large, imposing. They weren't drifting or exploring. They were heading directly toward his property. Porter's stomach dropped. Somehow he knew exactly who they were. They arrived like thunder without the storm. 3 Apache warriors dismounted from their horses in perfect unison, each movement calculated and deliberate. Porter had never seen men so large or so quietly menacing. The first stood nearly 7 feet tall, his broad shoulders stretching the limits of his buckskin shirt. The second was equally imposing, with scars across his knuckles that spoke of countless battles. The third, though slightly shorter, carried himself with the coiled tension of a mountain cat ready to strike. Porter stepped out of his cabin, his heart hammering against his ribs. He'd left his rifle inside, a decision that now seemed either wise or foolish depending on these men's intentions. "You are Porter Dale," the tallest one said. It wasn't a question. "I am." Porter's voice came out steadier than he felt. "And you are?" "I am Gideon." The giant gestured to his companions. "These are my brothers, Thorn and Boone. We have come about our sister." Sister. The word hit Porter like a physical blow. The woman who'd taken his lashes was related to these warriors. Suddenly, her sacrifice carried an entirely different weight. "Your sister," Porter repeated, his throat dry. "I don't understand why she—" "Neither do we," Thorn interrupted, his voice like gravel. "Willa returned to our camp bleeding, refusing to explain why she took punishment meant for a white farmer she claimed not to know. Willa." Finally, Porter had a name to match the face that had haunted his dreams. But the revelation only deepened the mystery. "She wouldn't speak of you," Boone added, stepping closer. Despite his smaller stature, something about him seemed the most dangerous of the three. "But she spoke your name in her sleep. Porter Dale." Again and again, Porter's mind reeled. How could a woman he'd never met know his name well enough to speak it in her dreams? How could she sacrifice herself for someone she claimed not to know? "I've never seen your sister before yesterday," Porter said, meeting their eyes despite every instinct screaming at him to look away. "I swear it. When the marshal called my name, I was ready to take my punishment." She stepped forward without warning. Gideon studied Porter with the intensity of a man accustomed to reading lies. "You expect us to believe our sister bled for a stranger? That she risked bringing shame upon our family for someone who means nothing to her?" "I don't expect you to believe anything," Porter replied. "I'm telling you what happened. I wish I could explain it, but I can't." The three brothers exchanged glances, communicating in a language Porter couldn't understand. Finally, Gideon spoke again. "There is something you should know about our sister. Willa doesn't act without reason. If she sacrificed herself for you, there is a connection you haven't yet remembered." Remembered. The word sent ice through Porter's veins. What had he forgotten? "Tell us about the winter you spent in the mountains," Gideon said, his dark eyes never leaving Porter's face. 7 years ago. Porter's blood went cold. How could they possibly know about that winter? He'd never told anyone the full truth about those months. "I don't know what you're talking about," he lied, but even he could hear the weakness in his voice. Thorn stepped closer, close enough that Porter could see the intricate beadwork on his vest. "You were found half dead in a snowbank by Apache hunters. They brought you to our winter camp. You spent 3 months recovering from frostbite and fever." The memories came flooding back like a dam bursting. Porter stumbled backward, his legs suddenly unsteady. He'd buried those months so deep he'd almost convinced himself they were a fever dream. His father had been furious when Porter finally returned home, missing for an entire season with no explanation that wouldn't sound like madness. "You remember now," Boone observed, his voice oddly gentle despite his intimidating presence. Porter's hands shook as the pieces fell into place. The Apache camp, the warm lodge where he'd recovered, the family that had saved his life when he'd gotten lost during a blizzard while hunting, and the young girl who'd brought him food every day, who'd sat beside his bed when the fever made him delirious. "Willa," he whispered. "She was barely 15 then," Gideon said. "You were 19, close to death. She convinced our father to let the white boy stay until he was strong enough to travel. For 3 months she tended to you like family." Porter remembered her now. Younger, smaller, but with the same steady dark eyes. She'd spoken to him in broken English, teaching him words in Apache while he recovered. When he'd finally been strong enough to leave, she'd walked him to the edge of their territory. "Why didn't I remember her yesterday?" Porter asked, his voice hoarse. "Because you chose to forget," Thorn replied bluntly. "Our father said you were frightened when you left. Frightened of what people in town would think if they knew Apache had saved your life. You buried the memory to protect yourself. The shame hit Porter like a physical blow. They were right. He'd been so worried about what his father would say, what the townspeople would think, that he'd forced himself to forget the kindness he'd received. He'd convinced himself it had been a dream, brought on by near death and fever. She saved my life then, Porter said quietly, and now she's saved me again. But why? Gideon demanded. Why would she risk everything for someone who abandoned the memory of her kindness? Porter met the giant's eyes, finally understanding the depth of his own failure. Because she's a better person than I am. That's when they heard the sound that changed everything. Hoofbeats approaching fast, and angry voices shouting Porter's name. 6 riders thundered toward Porter's property, dust clouds rising behind their horses like angry spirits. Porter recognized the lead rider immediately. Marshal Edwards, the same man who'd administered Willa's punishment the day before. Behind him rode 5 townspeople, including Henrik from the general store and the blacksmith whose debts Porter had never been able to pay. "Porter Dale!" the marshal shouted as they approached. "You've got some explaining to do." The 3 Apache warriors moved with fluid precision, positioning themselves between Porter and the approaching riders. Gideon's hand rested casually on the handle of his knife, while Thorne and Boone flanked him like wolves protecting their pack. Marshal Edwards pulled his horse to a sharp stop just outside Porter's fence, his eyes widening as he took in the massive Apache men. "Well, well, this explains everything." "Explains what?" Porter stepped forward, though he had to force his legs to move. "The Apache girl," Henrik called out from behind the marshal. "She's missing from wherever these savages are keeping her. They probably sent her to take your lashes as part of some scheme." Porter felt his temper flare at the slur, but Gideon's voice cut through the air like a blade before Porter could speak. "Choose your words carefully. White man, the woman you speak of is our sister, and she is worth more than all of you combined." The marshal's hand moved toward his gun, but he hesitated when he saw how calmly the 3 Apache men waited. These weren't frightened or desperate men. They were warriors who'd faced worse odds and survived. "Look, we don't want trouble," Marshal Edwards said, though his voice carried less authority than before. "But people are asking questions. Yesterday an Apache takes punishment for a white farmer. Today, 3 Apache warriors show up at his farm. It looks suspicious." "Suspicious of what?" Porter demanded. "Conspiracy," the blacksmith shouted. "Maybe you made some deal with them. Maybe you promised them something in exchange for the girl taking your punishment." Porter felt sick. These people were twisting Willa's act of kindness into something ugly and calculating. They couldn't accept that someone might sacrifice herself purely out of human decency. "There was no deal," Porter said firmly. "Then explain why she knew your name," Marshal Edwards pressed. "Several witnesses heard her speak it before she stepped forward. How does an Apache girl know the name of a failing farmer?" Porter looked at the 3 brothers, seeing the tension in their faces. They were waiting for his answer, waiting to see if he would honor their sister's sacrifice or throw her to these wolves to save himself. This was his choice. Tell the truth about the winter that changed his life, or let these people believe lies about the woman who'd saved him twice. "Because," Porter said, his voice growing stronger with each word, "7 years ago she saved my life when I was dying in the mountains, and yesterday she did it again." The silence that followed was deafening. Then Henrik laughed, a bitter sound that made Porter's skin crawl. "You expect us to believe you've been keeping company with savages? That changes everything, Porter. That changes everything." Marshal Edwards dismounted slowly, his hand still hovering near his gun. "Porter Dale, by the authority vested in me, you're under arrest for conspiracy with hostile Indians." "Hostile?" Gideon's voice carried a deadly calm. "We have done nothing but seek answers about our sister." "Your sister interfered with lawful punishment," the marshal replied, though he kept his distance from the towering Apache warrior. "And now we find out Dale here has been in league with your people for years." Porter felt the situation spiraling beyond his control. "There was no conspiracy. I told you the truth. She saved my life once, and yesterday she did it again." Henrik spat into the dirt. Once a savage lover, always a savage lover. No wonder your farm's failing. Dale, you've been too busy consorting with Indians to do honest work. The insult hit Porter like a physical blow, but before he could respond, Thorne stepped forward. Despite being the quietest of the three brothers, something in his movement made every man in the posse take a step back. "You will not speak of our sister that way," Thorne said softly, "and you will not arrest this man for telling the truth. Now you listen here," the blacksmith started, but his voice cracked when Boone's dark eyes fixed on him. The tension stretched taut as a bowstring. 6 armed white men faced 3 Apache warriors and 1 farmer. Porter realized that any sudden movement could turn this confrontation deadly. That's when he heard her voice. Enough. Every head turned toward the sound. Willa emerged from behind Porter's cabin, moving with the same quiet dignity she'd shown during her punishment. But now Porter could see what he'd missed before, the way she carried herself. The intelligence in her dark eyes, the strength that went far deeper than physical courage. She wore a simple dress, her long black hair braided with small strips of leather. Across her back, Porter could see the edges of bandages, where the lashes had torn her skin. The sight filled him with a fresh wave of shame and something else, a protective instinct so strong it surprised him. "Willa," Gideon said, relief and concern mixing in his voice. "You should not be here." "But I am here," she replied, her English clear and precise. She looked at each man in the posse, her gaze lingering on Marshall Edwards. "You want to know why I took his punishment? I will tell you." Porter held his breath. What would she say? What truth would she reveal that he couldn't remember? "This man," Willa continued, pointing at Porter, "did something 7 years ago that changed everything for my people. Something that saved lives. Something that created a debt we could never repay." Porter's mind raced. He remembered being nursed back to health, remembered the kindness shown to him. But what had he done to save Apache lives? "What debt?" Marshall Edwards demanded. Willa smiled, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Porter saw something that looked like hope. "He warned us about the winter raid." Porter's world tilted. Winter raid? He searched his fragmented memories of those fever-filled months, but found only scattered images. Warm broth, gentle hands, words in a language he barely understood. "What raid?" Marshall Edwards demanded, but his voice had lost some of its authority. The word raid carried implications none of them wanted to face. Willa's eyes never left Porter's face as she spoke. While he recovered from his injuries, Porter overheard 2 white men planning an attack on our winter camp. They thought he was unconscious, but the fever had broken. He heard everything. The memory crashed back like a physical blow. Porter staggered, his hand reaching for his cabin wall for support. 2 fur traders had visited the town doctor, asking about Apache winter camps. They'd spoken freely in front of what they assumed was a dying man, discussing their plan to raid the camps for horses and supplies when the warriors were away hunting. "I remember," Porter whispered, his voice hoarse. "Thompson and Wade. They wanted to know which camps would be vulnerable. And you told us," Gideon said quietly. "Despite being weak, despite barely knowing our language, you managed to warn our father. 14 women and children would have died that night," Willa added. "Instead, our warriors were waiting. Thompson and Wade never returned to town." The silence stretched taut as bowstrings. Marshall Edwards' face had gone pale. "Thompson and Wade disappeared 7 years ago. We assumed they'd moved on to California. They moved on to the grave," Thorne said flatly. Henrik backed toward his horse. "You're talking about murder, about white men being killed by savages." "We're talking about justice," Boone replied, his voice deadly calm. "About defending our families from men who would slaughter sleeping children." Porter felt the weight of understanding settle on his shoulders like a heavy coat. This was why Willa had sacrificed herself for him. Not just because her family had saved his life, but because he had saved theirs first. The debt ran deeper than gratitude. It ran to blood and honor. "So when she saw you facing punishment," Gideon continued, She could not let the man who saved our children suffer alone. Porter looked at Willa, really looked at her for the first time since that winter. She was no longer the 15-year-old girl who'd brought him soup and taught him Apache words. She was a woman now, strong and beautiful, with eyes that held depths he was only beginning to understand. "You didn't have to do that," he said softly. "Yes, I did," she replied, and something in her voice made his heart quicken. Some debts can only be paid with sacrifice. Marshal Edwards cleared his throat, breaking the spell. "This doesn't change anything. You still interfered with lawful punishment. And I would do it again," Willa said firmly. That's when Henrik drew his gun. "Enough talk," the storekeeper snarled. "I don't care what happened 7 years ago. I won't have Apache lovers and their savage friends in my town." The world exploded into motion. Henrik's gun never cleared its holster. Thorn moved faster than Porter thought humanly possible, his hand clamping down on Henrik's wrist with bone-crushing force. The storekeeper screamed as his weapon fell to the dirt, but Thorn didn't release his grip. "You drew first," Thorn said quietly. "That makes this self-defense." Marshal Edwards raised his own gun but found himself staring down the barrels of 2 Apache arrows. Gideon and Boone had moved with silent precision, their bows drawn and ready. The other townspeople sat frozen on their horses, suddenly understanding how outmatched they were. "Nobody else has to get hurt," Porter said, stepping between the two groups. His voice carried a strength that surprised even him. "But I won't let anyone threaten these people." "These people," Henrik spat, cradling his injured wrist. "They're savages. They admitted to murdering Thompson and Wade." "Thompson and Wade were planning to murder children," Porter replied firmly. "If you can't see the difference, that says more about you than about them." Marshal Edwards lowered his gun slowly, his eyes moving between the Apache warriors and Porter. "You're really willing to stand with them against your own kind?" Porter looked at Willa, saw the steady faith in her dark eyes, and felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. For 7 years, he'd lived as a coward, burying the memory of kindness because he feared what others might think. But this woman had bled for him. Her family had saved his life and asked nothing in return. "They are my kind," Porter said. "More than you'll ever be." The words hung in the air like thunder. Henrik made a strangled sound of outrage, but the marshal held up his hand for silence. "This is bigger than I thought," Edwards said slowly. "If Thompson and Wade were planning what you say they were planning—" "They were," Gideon said, finally lowering his bow. "We have their journal. They'd been watching our camps for months, waiting for the right moment to strike." "Show me," the marshal demanded. Boone reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a leather-bound book. He tossed it to Edwards, who caught it and began reading. Porter watched the marshal's face grow paler with each page. "Sweet Jesus," Edwards whispered. "They weren't just planning raids. They were planning massacres. Women, children, elders." He looked up at the Apache warriors with something approaching respect. "You stopped them." "Porter stopped them," Willa said softly. "We just carried out the justice he made possible." Henrik struggled to his feet, still clutching his wrist. "I don't care what that book says. I want these savages out of my town." "It's not your town," a new voice called out. Everyone turned to see Mayor Richardson riding toward them with 3 other prominent townsmen. Porter's heart sank. More trouble was coming. But the mayor's first words surprised everyone. "Edwards, put your gun away. Henrik, get back on your horse before you embarrass yourself further." Richardson dismounted and walked directly to Gideon. "I owe you an apology." Mayor Richardson extended his hand to Gideon, who studied it for a long moment before accepting the gesture. "I've spent the morning reading every report about Thompson and Wade's disappearance," Richardson said. "Found some interesting letters in Wade's room at the boarding house. Letters describing their plans in detail." He looked around at the assembled men. "Plans that would have made us all accessories to murder, if they'd succeeded." Henrik's face went crimson. "You can't be serious, Mayor. You're taking the word of savages over evidence?" Richardson cut him off. "Over written proof. Henrik, these people saved us from becoming a town known for child killing. I'd shut your mouth if I were you. Marshal Edwards handed the journal back to Boone. The charges against Porter are dropped, and I'm recommending that the territorial governor commend these Apache for preventing a massacre. Porter felt something loosen in his chest, a weight he'd been carrying for 7 years finally lifting. But when he looked at Willa, he realized the real change was just beginning. There's something else, Mayor Richardson continued. The town council has voted to offer a formal treaty with your people. Trade agreements, safe passage, mutual protection. If you're interested. Gideon looked at his brothers, then at Willa. We will consider it, but the decision belongs to our chief. Of course. Richardson tipped his hat. Porter, you'll be our liaison, if you're willing. Porter nodded, understanding that his life had just changed forever. No more hiding. No more shame about the connections that had saved his life. As the officials and townspeople began to disperse, Henrik mounted his horse with obvious reluctance. This isn't over, he muttered. Yes, it is, Porter replied quietly. It's been over for 7 years. You just didn't know it yet. When the last rider disappeared over the horizon, Porter found himself alone with Willa and her 3 giant brothers. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across his property, and for the first time in years, Porter felt like he truly owned this land. Will you stay for supper? Porter asked, looking primarily at Willa but including all 3 brothers in the invitation. Gideon smiled, the first genuine warmth Porter had seen from him. We will stay, but first my sister has something to say to you. Thorne and Boone moved tactfully toward the horses, giving Porter and Willa privacy while remaining close enough to fulfill their protective duties. Willa stepped closer, close enough that Porter could see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes. You could have let them blame me for everything. Could have stayed silent and safe. I've been silent too long, Porter replied. 7 years too long. She reached out and touched his hand, a brief contact that sent warmth up his arm. The boy I nursed back to health was brave but frightened. The man standing here now is just brave. Porter turned his hand palm up, allowing her fingers to rest against his. I had a good teacher. Perhaps, Willa said, a hint of a smile playing at her lips. It's time for new lessons. 6 months later, when the first official trade delegation arrived at the combined Dale-Apache settlement, they found a thriving community where Porter Dale and his Apache wife Willa managed both crops and horses with equal skill. Their partnership had become the foundation for the most successful cross-cultural alliance in the territory. And every night as they sat on the porch of their expanded cabin, Porter thanked whatever forces had brought Willa back into his life, not once, but twice, when he needed her most. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale, where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.